so that you know who we are. My name is Jim Deely. I am the current chair of the board.
Nate Oxnard.
I'm Zach Langlois.
I'm Shelley Tetrault.
Heckman.
All right, and we're happy that everybody came out, and we're interested in hearing from you tonight. This is an open discussion that we're going to have. Do want to set some kind of ground rules so that we are all on the same page in terms of discussion tonight. We do have a microphone here, and I know I hate talking to a microphone, and I hate hearing myself talk. It kind of is what it is. But we do ask that if you have a question, please come to the microphone, because we are recording this so that folks who can't attend tonight can spend some time watching what the discussion, where the discussion goes tonight. I would ask that you limit your questions to 2 to 3 minutes, and that if someone has not asked a question, that they get to go before people who have already asked questions. We intend to leave enough time for everybody to have everything answered. We're aiming for probably finishing around 8 o'clock. If we finish before that, that's fantastic. We need to go a little bit longer, that's okay. So, to start with, we're all here to talk about high school. Wanted to start with a little bit of a background on where we are as a community with high school. Currently, we are sending all of our kids to Concord. Concord is our school of record. We have a contract with Concord that was started in 2004. It's a 20-year contract. At the 10-year mark, it was renegotiated, and it changed the terms of the contract. It did not change the actual term of the contract. So we are under contract for another 6 years at this point. Concord, for those who don't have kids in Concord, there are currently 1,780 kids attending Concord High School. We are the only town that tuitions into Concord. So everyone at Concord High School lives in the town or the city of Concord, besides for the Deerfield kids. We have, in the past, had a lot of different models in this town, but had a lot of consistency since everyone has been going to Concord. We are also working on a competency educational model in our school here, and that aligns with what is going on in the Concord School District. So they are, if anybody has been to any of the PACE forums at this point, we are a Tier 2 PACE school. We are not fully implemented into the PACE program, and that's a whole other discussion. Concord is a Tier 1, so they are a fully integrated PACE school. And if anybody needs kind of a rundown of that, I'm happy to speak to it. It's probably better if Mr. Oxnard speaks to it, though. Does everybody know what that is, or would you like a brief description? All right, we will move on. In terms of where we are, we did do a survey last November where we got about 100 responses in terms of feedback on students who had gone through and parents who had gone through this school and also were either attending or had attended Concord High School. And there were overwhelmingly positive things to say about Concord. We do also, as a board, regularly hear from you guys about what, basically I guess the number one thing that we hear from the community is high school is really far away. And is this where we're going? And questions about high school. It is a complicated issue. So I thought we would start a little bit with Nate giving a background on the history of where Deerfield was and how we got to where we are. So,
Sure. Before about 16 years ago, leading up into the year 2000, there was no school of record for Deerfield, and that led to the situation where students would apply to, from 8th grade, would apply to their high school, And they would try to gain acceptance, just like kind of applying to college, but this happened when you were 13 or 14 rather than when you were a senior in high school. And there were, at the time, enough local schools with space that it wasn't really an issue in that students would find their own transportation, they would gain acceptance to the school where they were hoping to go, or maybe not, and then maybe their second or third choice. As towards the end of late 90s, 2000, it got to the point where the schools were getting crowded, and so with less space, that meant some more competition. Fewer students were getting their first choices. They're led to, from what I didn't live in town at that point, but what I've heard is that there was a fair amount of tension. There got to be some animosity between community members who were all kind of applying for the same spots. It reached a head in the early 2000s where I think we were sending students to roughly 16 different high schools in the area. And at that point there was, I think, a situation where a few students did not get accepted. There wasn't enough space, so I think at the time the superintendent negotiated some sort of way of having these students find a placement in a local high school. That was when the contract was initiated. That was when the school board at the time began discussions. They contracted with Concord, and that's led to kind of where we are. But about 4 or 5 years ago, the board at the time started, 10 years into the contract, reopened the question and looked into the question of, are there other schools in the local area that could perhaps better meet our needs? There was parental input. They collected a lot of information. In the end, the board at the time decided to stick with the contract for a number of reasons. They ran a survey through the UNH Survey Center, and that came back, of the respondents, overwhelmingly positive about the experience at Concord. Concord had a lot of opportunities that other local schools were not able to offer. The diversity that's found there was valued by the district, the board at the time, and for a number of reasons that ended up being the school that the board wanted to maintain the contract with, and so they changed the language a little bit, kept the same overall contract, but just sort of changed the language to change the 95% number, which is, we are committed to sending 95% of our students to Concord. Now it's been moved to 90%. And also there was a decrease in our rate that we're paying Concord for tuition. But as Mr. Deely mentioned, that we have, that contract expires in about 6 years, and so that kind of brings us to where we are. Regarding the competencies, education is in general across the country moving the direction of competency-based education, and so Concord is at the head of that work, and they've been, from my perspective, over the past couple of years of my being on the board, we've worked closely with meeting with the administration. They've come over and met with us a couple times to give us detailed information on how our students are doing, and helped us align our school here with their approach to education, the competency-based model, and we're speaking for myself, I'm pleased with how that's been going and how that relationship has been working over the past couple of years.
All right. So a couple other things. I know you were all given a handout when you came in. If you are not interested in speaking at a microphone, I totally understand. Write your question on the handout. The board will read all of those. Do you want to talk a little bit about where we are as a board right now? In terms of, right, so this is the beginning of a conversation. We are here to listen to the community. There are no plans at this point. Zach had a good analogy earlier today where we're sitting in the driveway with the car in park. Nothing is happening. We want to hear from the community. We want to know what you folks think about the situation. So this is us listening to you. So I will, if everybody's okay to see anything else the board would like to say before, I will open up the floor, and I am going to ask, use the microphone, please. Anyone?
I will. I don't care. I have a big mouth. Everybody knows that.
Please introduce yourself too.
My name is Stacy Sobo. I have a son in 6th grade, Aiden Quirk, and my son Devin Quirk graduated 2 years ago. Devin goes to Trinity High School because we did not want him going to Concord. It wasn't a good fit for him as a person. I'm not saying Concord wasn't a good school, but it just wasn't a good fit for him. He came from a Catholic background at St. Catherine, so that's why we continued his education at Trinity. However, with having friends in Hooksett, Auburn, all these other places, I'm noticing more that towns are able to choose where they want their kids to go. Hooksett has 6 opportunities. You know, they can go to Pinkerton, they can go to Bow, they can go to Central, they can go to all these different places. And their tax dollars are going to those schools in which their kids are picking. And I know Concord's a great school, but it's not a good fit for everybody's child. It's a huge school. And I do know people that have kids there, and they're all doing wonderfully. Some aren't doing well, and they're taking them out, and they're putting them in smaller schools. So to have the opportunity with all of us paying as much as we do in tax dollars here in Deerfield would be wonderful if we could have at least 3 different choices for our kids to go to school somewhere else. If they're not going to fit into a large school like Concord, or maybe a smaller school like Co-Brown or Oyster River or something like that. I'm not too sure what the numbers are there. But I think it's important for families to be able to qualify their children and where they want to go to school versus being told where they have to go. And we're paying a lot of money every month for our older son to go to Trinity. And he's doing wonderful there, but if we had the opportunity to send him to a smaller school where we think he would have done better, it would be a lot easier for us if we were given that opportunity. So that's all I have to say.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you can ask us questions.
Oh, I can?
We'll talk back, yeah.
Hi, Sarita Fry. My daughter is in 6th grade. I have a question and then a comment. So the
Sure.
question is, you mentioned that 90%, so the current contract says it will send 90%
Correct.
of students in Concord, but my understanding is that we don't have the opportunity to, there's no, raffle's not the word.
Lottery?
Lottery. There's no lottery anymore. So what happens to the other 10%?
So 10% realistically represents usually 4 to 5 kids per class. That's kind of the average of where most of our classes are in the 40 to 50, maybe 60 range. Some of them are getting a little bit bigger. Is anybody familiar with the lottery?
Yeah.
Is
So-
everyone familiar with the lottery?
So there is a lottery.
There was a lottery. So a couple of years ago,
That's it, and I have a comment.
sure. So there was a lottery system.
Was that lottery held up for everybody to see? Because I was not aware. I mean, I was told when my son was denied for the lottery system that he just didn't get in. But I was never told when the lottery was, where it was going to be. I never actually saw something spin
Right.
with the...
So we can't just have questions thrown out. So
Right.
if you got a question, come to the mic. The lottery was a system that required a random choosing in usually around the November period. It does not exist anymore. And what it did was allow for a handful of kids to choose other public schools and wind up going to those public schools. However, the lottery also had a couple of caveats with it. One of them was that if there was a sibling who had already gone to an alternative rather than Concord High School, that the younger sibling, because of the burden it would put on the parents, would be put at the front of the lottery line. So very often the entire lottery would wind up siblings of kids who were already in the lottery system. There was a lot of back and forth on how the lottery should function, and the board at the time voted to eliminate the lottery on a 3-2 vote. The only way for that 10% to go somewhere else is to apply to, what do we call it? It's the school reassignment policy, where you make a case that your child should go to a different school. It is reviewed by a committee within the school. It is then recommended out of the committee to the superintendent. The superintendent then makes a recommendation, yes or no, and then the superintendent brings it before the board. it is a more onerous, like basically there isn't a, you win the lottery, you go to a different school. It now is an entire process. So, does that answer the question? Does that make sense? Okay.
And then a comment.
Yes.
So I'm also, like the previous speaker, in favor of having choice for a number of reasons, including fit for, individual students. But the other big issue for me is logistics. And so, I work on the seacoast, I work in Durham. So for my daughter to be in Concord while I'm in Durham every day is a real challenge in terms of, well, I assume it will be a challenge, she's in 6th grade now, but thinking about that, if she wants to do after-school activities or anything like that, it's going to be very challenging. And so for me, having an option that's closer to where I work would be useful.
So, sorry, can I ask a question? So I'm looking for a show of hands more than anything else, because this is a curiosity for me. So everybody in the room presumably has children that are going to be entering high school at some point. I think everybody travels in the morning in the same direction I travel, but I realistically know that people go in every direction. So I'm just curious, as a quick show of hands, the people in this room that travel towards Manchester or south towards Massachusetts on a daily basis? Okay, and then the people that travel to the seacoast? Okay, and then who travels north towards Concord or Laconia or that general area? Thank you.
Wow.
So I have a question about what,
Please introduce yourself.
sorry, Sharon French.
Sure.
I have kids in younger grades, 2nd and 4th now. My question is this, I don't know what options are there, because I hear people saying a lot of, I'd like to have choice, and I hear our current contract says we send 10%. Realistically, what do you guys know about if we went to Concord and said, hey, we're not going to say we're going to send a certain number, would they accept that? Also, are there other options that are open to our kids? I don't know what information you guys have at this point.
We have not had any discussions at all with Concord about reopening this contract. And what they would respond, anything they felt like. You're getting into a negotiation with them. They could approach it however they would like. So.
And again, this is that the car is still in the driveway, we're still in park, we are trying to, all of us collectively hear what we all hear individually throughout our interactions with families all over town. People, you tend to, we all have kids that are slightly different ages, so our kids are all in different circles, and those circles have us interacting with different groups of parents. And I think we all hear a lot of the same thing, but we all need to hear it at the same time, and that's what we're really trying to accomplish.
Jim, would this be
Sure.
a good point to bring up that new legislation?
Like, go ahead.
Okay.
Right.
Put my foot right in that. So the other thing that needs to be considered, and I know we have a state rep here in the audience, but is there's new legislation about school choice out that's been put on the books, but we're not sure how it's going to be enforced or applied or anything like that yet. That still remains to be seen, and the impacts that it will have on negotiations, not just for our school district, but for all school districts, how that will affect these contracts going forward. We might conceivably could go back to having to deal with maybe not 16 schools of, but it could be multiple. It just, there's, that potential is
Right.
theoretical.
So there was a bill that was put forth that spoke to communities that did not have a high school or a school of record. And we technically do have a school of record, even though the language between the law and the language between the agreement is not exactly the same. The legal opinion that we've gotten is that we have a school of record. We are not one of the communities that can just open things up. Kevin, would you like to speak to this?
Kevin Burwell, I'm one of the state reps for Acadia, Deerfield, Nottingham. The bill is commonly referred to as the Croydon bill, and it passed this last year, was signed into law by the governor and has since taken full effect. So what the law says is if a community does not have a local public school for a particular grade set, that they are free to contract and/or tuition with any school that the community chooses, and it doesn't have to be a public school. So a community can choose to contract with a non-public school to provide public school functions for the community. I agree, currently we have a school of record at Concord High, but that's contingent on the contract and the continuation thereof. So if the contract expires, then you no longer would have a school of record, unless the contract has an evergreen clause. And I'm not, I have to admit, I'm not that familiar with the Concord contract. If anybody has questions on Croydon, I'll try to answer them. Since I'm here, I've got a couple of things I would like to throw out.
Sure.
One thing is we hear about polls, and I've seen a lot of polls go out, and I have to admit, I really wonder how reliable or scientific they are because of the way that they're getting out. I'm not convinced we're fully surveying the community at large, and so I'm always a little skeptical of what that most of that polling data looks like. The other thing I've heard, I just heard it tonight, and I've seen it in social media, and that is, you know, we're hearing from people, but really we need to hear from everybody, you know, in one setting, so everybody hears the same thing. And while there's value in a community forum, and I appreciate you guys taking the time and putting this on, certainly early in the process like we should, some people can't make it to these forums. Some people don't want to come to these forums, and some people will come, but they certainly don't want to speak. And I would certainly encourage you to take all input from all constituents in any way, shape, or form that they communicate it to you, and make that part of your data set. One of the elephants in the room, a lot of people thought that the last process didn't work. That there was a process that was described, there was a process that was followed, but the decision-making was completely divorced of that process, that the process really was sort of to say, oh, we got community input and we took it all into consideration and this is what we decided to do. And I think it's really important, and I don't think it's the first time that's happened in this community, although I haven't lived here long enough to know that for sure. I certainly hope you guys will define the process really well as what the accept-reject criteria is. What are the gates that make the decision so that people can effectively lobby and know where they should be putting their energy. I've heard and seen more about school options recently than I have in a long time. And one suggestion I would make, because when you go to Concord, it's a new negotiation or with any school. I would suggest you consider not having a guaranteed percentage. Perhaps saying, we would expect this number of students to attend whatever the primary school we contract with is, but have a policy as a district that allows families, if families choose a different solution for high school for their children, that they have a way to access that. And so what that means to me is if we're going to school X and I choose to send my children to school Y, and it's a legal option, it's not an option that violates any RSAs, that I would get at least whatever the tuition rate is applied to that. And if it costs more, that's on the parents, right? You have to make up the difference. And if it costs less, the money comes back to the district. You don't get to put the money in the pocket. And if a school balks and says, I need a guaranteed number because that's the only way I can make my numbers work, you know, it's a pretty simple sell to say, well, based on what we hear, we would expect 80%, 90%, 75% to attend here, but you're the one selling the product. So if you've got a great product, they will flock to you, and if you don't, they won't. And it's perhaps a method that hasn't been fully considered in the past, and I would encourage you to give that some thought to allow the most flexibility to families to find the educational solution that works best for their particular children.
So, in terms of coming to a school and not giving them a guaranteed percentage, it makes it harder on the school that you're dealing with because they don't know how to appropriately staff for the next couple of years. It is something that could potentially be done, but it would, yeah, I mean, it would put an onus on that school to guess at how many kids were going to come.
Let's keep in mind, we're far away from any
Right.
sort of negotiations or changing anything. This is a discussion, this is basically fact-finding. Kevin makes very good points, and we will definitely keep those in mind going forward, but that's way far down the road from where we are currently.
Sure.
So let's start at a very high level.
Forward. Hi, Leila Thompson, and you know who I am. And having a son who a year from now is going into 8th grade and then beyond, and it seems like yesterday he started kindergarten, this is something on my mind. So first I want to thank you for even opening this up. I want to make a statement that I pay more than your average amount of attention to some things. And coming into this, I already had a few perceptions that what you have said tonight is different. So I was thinking we're still at 95%, we're at 90%. So roughly for his grade, that means 6 children, at 60 kids, could have a choice. I'm aware of how to apply for an alternate school. I didn't even know up until tonight that was it. So one, I do have a question, but when children are coming into 8th grade, I think it would be really helpful if you had an information session. And not necessarily to get people to go to alternate schools, but though there are some kids that it's just not going to work at Concord. And for parents, it can be really stressful. Going back to what you were saying 20 years ago, how stressful it was, it's that stressful for some people who really think that Concord's not a choice. And two,
What kind of information session? Like
when in 8th grade information session, when you learn about even the field trip,
yeah.
or things like that, if at the start of the year when parents are coming into 8th grade, even if it's transparent how, if you really think this isn't a choice for your child, or that's not a grade, if you're looking at different high schools, that you can be aware of what the process is you need to go through to advocate for your child.
Okay.
So just something to make it, just to use the word transparent. So we know what we're up against, or what we need to do, or how can people go about the process. And two, I have a question.
Sure.
When people choose not to send their children to Concord, and like the parent who said they're sending their child to Trinity, how does that impact our Concord contract? When people, you're not sending 95% if somebody's paying for their child to go elsewhere, so that child's out of the numbers. Does that impact how many weekends? So the 6 or the 90% is independent of that?
Kids that go to private school are not included in the number.
Okay, so they don't.
So it would reduce the class size by 1, or by however many kids go to private school.
Okay, but
So if you had 10 kids, then there would be,
One less.
There'd be one less.
On the other hand, there are other inputs, homeschoolers that are choosing to put their children in public schools, so
okay.
it's a fluid.
everything is moving.
Okay.
It's a fluid number.
So when do you make the determination of what that number is in November?
Well,
Because you don't know in November.
we
if people are
have,
sending-
so the way the process is right now is we have the flexibility, we have the flexibility to send 10% of our kids somewhere else. The board defers to the administration and the superintendent to decide how many people they're going to recommend to us to send somewhere else. They may not send 6 kids. They may say, we have 3 kids, or they may say we have 6 kids, but the process at this point goes through the administration and then through the superintendent and back to the board.
Is there ever flexibility if you had 7 candidates that really, really needed a different choice? Is there ever flexibility to that?
We are,
Don't know that.
well, it would be an exception to a contract.
And I don't know if we've been in that situation.
Thanks.
Just for a note for Kevin, the contract ends hard in 2024.
My client, I have a daughter in 6th grade. I'm just trying to understand the context. I've been in all the other meetings. I thought we're signed to a contract to 2024, short of a lawsuit or whatever, break the contract, it is what it is, and it's going to be to 2024, which is at best 10%, 90. Is that true or no?
There is a clause that allows us to come out of the contract.
What would that clause be?
The school board would have to give notification to Concord that we were interested in coming out of the contract. It's a 2-year window, so we would
You would have to give notice now for 2 years.
for 2 years from now.
Just a quick follow-up on that. So,
Microphone.
I'm going to stand behind you. Just a quick follow-up on that, because that sounds a little different than what I heard earlier. So the contract is written until 2024, but if you voted in meeting to enter in, you could sever that contract within 24 months of a vote of the board. Is that correct? Okay, so it's,
Either side.
so it's anywhere from 2 to 6 year.
Correct.
Duration.
Thank you.
But our kids would be good if they finished it, if they're freshmen.
Hi.
How are you? Tim Griffin. I have a 2nd grader and a 5th grader. Just as I was looking at the paper, I saw one thing missing, and I added it myself, but wanted to publicly say, arts and music is something that I think should be a high consideration as we're looking at different options out there. We have athletics covered and VOTEC, but arts and music I think is very important for well-rounded children. The other thing that as we talk about school choice, I'm sure this is on everybody's mind, but if there were such a thing as, okay, we can pick from these 3 schools, the impact that would have on DCS, and how are we preparing kids who may be going to disparate institutions afterwards, and, is this school prepared for that? So something that I'd like to see us continue to talk about if that continues down that road.
Right. So, thanks.
Thank you.
I'm Sadie Stimmel. I was wondering if you can speak to the logistics of transportation
Sure.
and bus systems if we are not going to Concord.
Sure. So in New Hampshire, legally, no school district is obligated to provide transportation to high school at all. That just doesn't need to happen. Right now, we provide buses to Concord. If we wound up with multiple schools, I have no idea how it would play out. A bus is, what, about $50,000? It's about $50-something thousand a year per bus. So.
Hey, I can tell you from my experience growing up in Deerfield, I went to Central in Manchester, and at that point, this was 20 years ago, it was, there was a bus that went from town to Manchester, and it would loop through to the high schools in Manchester and essentially throw everybody off. That bus on any given day maybe had 12 kids on it that were going to Central in Manchester. I believe it went to Memorial beforehand, and then it actually would stop at Trinity and grab a couple of kids as well, that whatever was worked out at that point. But that was 20 years ago. There was a bus that also went from the center of town to Concord or any other schools, but it didn't route through like the elementary buses did. Essentially, you got yourself to the start of the route, got on the bus, it brought you to the school, and at the end of the day, it would bring you back to the George B. White building or to wherever it was routed to go. So it was provided to an extent, but ultimately what ended up happening is as soon as you had a license or a friend of yours had a license, you bailed on the bus because you were leaving earlier than the kids do now, and coming home considerably later, and the parents were paying a monthly fee for that at the same time.
And when we wound up starting with Concord, there wasn't a bus. And I believe the parents were the parents paying at that point? I believe the parents were paying at that point too. So.
I have one other question just to ask. I'm fairly new to Deerfield. I've only been here about, I don't know, 7 years, I think. How come Deerfield, Hooksett, and Candia don't build a high school?
That's a great question.
I don't know.
Anybody remember all of, there we go, okay. So there were I think 2 or 3 attempts to create cooperative school districts. And it got to the point where there were plans, and each community needed to vote yes at their town meeting. And every single time, either 1 or 2 of the communities would vote no. So there was a huge amount of effort. At one point, there was a plan to build a high school, I think it was Fremont, Candia, and us, at the corner of 43 and 107. And that failed. I think Fremont said they didn't want to come. Candia said they didn't want to come, excuse me. Fremont and Deerfield said yes. So there's been weird assortments of towns put together. Deerfield tried it for years. There was about a decade or more period where a number of different combinations were tried, and it just failed.
And we don't have the numbers here to make it.
So I was going to say, let me dispel one other myth, because every realtor in the history of this town has told every family when they bought a house in Deerfield that, oh yeah, there'll be a high school by the time your kids go to high school.
There will not.
There will not be a high school in Deerfield because, quite frankly, you don't have the numbers to make it work. It's a mathematical equation that is just bad all around. So if your realtor told you that, I'm sorry. It's not going to happen.
Right.